Okay. Now we'll finish the female reproductive system. Okay. The purpose of the female reproductive system, like I said earlier, is not only to produce gametes, but to prepare to support a development embryo. Okay. And then later we'll talk about reproduction. Okay, so it undergoes changes according to the menstrual cycle. That's the monthly cycle, and we'll get a little bit into that later. Includes ovaries, okay, uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, as they're more commonly called, uterus and vagina. All right, so all the parts. Okay, the uterus. Oh, sorry, the ovaries. Sorry, the ovaries. Okay, the ovaries are produce ova or eggs. Okay, so here you see them here. Okay, so these two are the ovaries. This stuff we'll get into in a little bit, but here's the ovary. What it does is release the egg right here. Okay, and then the parts of the fallopian tube, as they're more commonly called, receive the ovulated oocyte. Okay, so the first part is the infundibulum. That's the distal end of the uterine tube. So they're surrounded by fimbriae. These are the little fingers, okay, that surround it. And what they do is they pump and they generate current. So they basically suck the egg into the fallopian tube. Sometimes it doesn't actually happen, okay? So sometimes eggs are just cast in the perineum and they get lost. But most of the time you get sucked into the fimbriae. Okay, the middle part of it is called the ampulla. That's actually where the sperm usually meets the egg. And the last part is called isthmus, okay, where it's thinner than the rest. Okay, the next thing is the uterus. Okay, so let's go over parts of the uterus. Okay, so the uterus, here's the body. Okay, this has a fundus. The three layers to the uterus. Okay, so metrium refers to uterus. So perimetrium, myometrium, endometrium. Perimetrium is the outer connective layer. Myo is muscle, right? It's the smooth muscle used for contractions. And endometrium is the innermost layer where the fertilization actually, or not the fertilization, sorry, the implantation actually happens. Okay. All right. So let's go over the other parts of it. Okay. So here on the bottom here is the cervix of the uterus, or usually called the cervix. Okay. It has two openings. The openings are called osses, an external opening to the vagina and an internal opening to the rest of the uterus. Okay. These two things are usually sealed. Okay. If there's no chance at reproduction, then you don't need anything to get in, because why risk infection unless there's a reason for the opening, and that seal right there. When it's the right time, when the egg is released, that opening is unsealed and allows sperm through. Okay. 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 The embryo. Okay, if there is an embryo, it burrows into the endometrium. So endometrium has two layers, a functional layer and a basal layer. Okay, so here you see the myometrium on the bottom here. and then there is a basal layer and a functional layer. Okay, the basal layer is always around, and it produces a new functional layer. If there is implantation, the implantation implants into the functional layer. Okay, if there is no implantation, you shed the functional layer, and the next month you grow a new functional layer from the basal layer. Okay. All right. The female monthly cycle. So the female menstrual cycle in oogenesis. Okay. The female monthly cycle is due to the hormonal fluctuations in the uterus and in the ovaries. So there's an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle. Obviously, the two of them work together. We just talk about them differently when we like look at them, because look at them all in entirety is a little complicated. So we focus. Sometimes we focus on the ovaries and what's happening in the ovaries, and we call that the ovarian cycle. And then we look at what's happening in the uterus and call it the uterine cycle. Okay, but you can see they sync up very well. Okay, the ovarian cycle has 3 phases: the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. Okay, so the follicular phase is the first half of the ovarian cycle. Okay, you start off stimulating 6 to 12 primordial follicles to develop. So we'll see what those are. Okay, so these little tiny things right there that you barely see is the primary follicle, primordial follicles. So 6 to 12 of them start developing. They turn into primary follicles. Okay, and then one of them gets to the secondary and eventually the antral follicle, or the graphene follicle as it's usually known. And then, yeah, okay, blah, blah, you start getting a zona pellucida, okay? The zona pellucida is the glycoprotein coat surrounding the oocyte, okay? So you can see the oocyte here has a clear layer around it. That's the zona pellucida, okay? Okay. So primary follicle become a secondary follicle. You develop something called a corona radiata. So let's take a look. Okay, so secondary follicles, you start developing a corona radiata. It's better seeing here. You see the cell in the middle here. There's this zona pellucida around it, and then around that is another layer called the corona radiata. Okay, the radiating sun. Okay, at this point, what will happen is this fluid, okay, will start to swell and eventually burst. Okay, and when it bursts, it pops this whole structure out. Okay, and that is ovulation. Ovulation occurs about halfway through each ovarian cycle, about day 14. Okay, it doesn't have to occur on day 14. Okay, everyone's monthly cycle is different. What alters though is the follicular phase. The follicular phase can be different. Okay, ovulation takes 1 day. The luteal phase is always 14 days. Okay, so what's different between women, and even in during a woman's lifetime, is not the luteal phase, it's the follicular phase. Okay, Okay. There is a sudden increase in luteinizing hormone during this phase. Okay, so luteinizing hormone spikes. Okay, and that luteinizing hormone, okay, along with the FSH spike, this is what causes ovulation. So ovulation will occur about 24 hours after the LH spike. Okay, if you buy those home, not the pregnancy kits, but the ovulation kits that they have, what they're measuring for is the LH spike in the blood. And there is a LH spike, and that means, within that day, it's time to get on. And, because that's the day the egg's coming out. The egg is only fertile for about 24 hours after it's released. Okay. You can fertilize, you can have the sperm there before. So there's about a 72-hour window where fertilization can occur. But the egg, if it's not once it's released, there's about 24-hour window where it can get fertilized. If it doesn't get fertilized during that time, it dies. Okay. So you can see here, okay, it is about, this is ovulation, day 14, okay, and you can see the spike. Okay. Show you what happens after ovulation. Okay, after ovulation, see the structure right there that released the egg. After that structure releases the egg, that turns into a yellow body, the corpus luteum. Okay, the corpus luteum will start secreting massive amounts of progesterone. Okay, progesterone, pro-gestation, right? Carrying the zygote or embryo. Okay, so the progesterone levels in the body rise. The progesterone prepares the uterus for pregnancy. Okay, all right, so there it goes. Now, if there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum eventually dies. If the corpus luteum dies, there's no more progesterone being released. If there's no more progesterone being released, that's when the uterus starts to contract and you shed the uterine lining, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. Okay? Okay, so here's the corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum dies eventually, okay, that little white thing becomes a corpus albicans. Okay, and you can see that there as well. Corpus albicans, white body, a white little scar. Okay. All right. I'm gonna come back and cover oogenesis in a little bit, but I'm gonna cover the uterine cycle first. Okay. So now we're looking at the uterus. Okay. The uterus looks at what's happening in the innermost layer of the uterus, the endometrium. Okay. So the phases correlate with the ovarian cycle. Okay. The first day of the uterine cycle is the menstrual phase, where the stratum functionalis is shed. Okay, so the first day they're shedding is usually considered the first day of the cycle. Okay, okay. Again, that's controlled by the ovary, right? The corpus luteum dying causes the progesterone to not be produced, and that causes the menstrual phase, which is the first day. Okay, so first day of the menstrual cycle, that syncs in with the first day of the ovarian cycle. Okay, So the shedding is for about 5 days. The next time, okay, you start building up again. That's the proliferative phase. And then the last 14 days is the secretory phase. The secretory phase matches up with the luteal phase. Okay, so the proliferative phase can vary as well as the menstrual phase, but the secretory phase does not vary, and it matches perfectly with the luteal phase. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the egg. Okay. So this occurs before birth. Okay. So the meiotic events, this all occurs before birth. This is very different than the sperm because the sperm, okay, developed after birth. In fact, it develops after puberty. Okay, but this occurs before birth. Okay, the other thing that's really different is the number of things produced. When we produce sperm, one stem cell results in 4 equal sperm. Okay, but here, because the egg is different, you make 1 egg and 3 little things called polar bodies. Okay, these polar bodies are not really involved in reproduction. The polar bodies are basically useless things that just have, it's just for accounting purposes. You need to divide your DNA a bunch of times, and when you divide your DNA, you form a new nucleus and you wrap it around as little cytoplasm as possible. Okay? So meiosis II of this polar body may or may not occur because it really doesn't matter if it occurs or not. What it needs really is just to get rid of half its DNA. Okay? So the DNA has to match, right, for the sperm to penetrate. Okay? So the purpose of the polar bodies is to accounting purposes, but we can actually hijack that and take advantage of that. Because if I can look at this this DNA, I can tell what this DNA is. If you have 1 in 2 chance of having a recessive thing, okay, recessive gene, then if this one is a recessive, this one's a dominant. If this one's the dominant, then this one's a recessive. So like you can tell them apart, and you can actually use that for screening purposes. Okay. Okay. All right. The vagina. Okay. The vagina consists of 3 coats: the adventitia, muscularis. Okay. So here is the vagina. The vagina has a diaphragm that it's an incomplete diaphragm most of the time. Sometimes it's not there, etc., etc. Okay. Okay, the external genitalia. There is the external genitalia together in the females, usually called the vulva. Okay, it's this of the mons pubis, the labia majora, and the vestibule. Okay, the mons pubis, pubic mound, okay, is just a layer of fat that overlies the pubic symphysis where the pubic hair is. Okay, the next thing is the labia majora. Labia means lips, majora is a bigger set. Underneath that is the labia minora, smaller set of lips. Okay, the labia majora is the homologue to the male scrotum. Okay, so the same tissue that makes a male scrotum makes a female labia majora. Okay, the vestibule is a space between the labia majora and between the two lips of the labia minora. Okay, and that houses the opening to both the urethra and the vagina. Okay, so urethra, vagina. Okay. The clitoris is anterior to the vestibule. It's erectile tissue. That's the female homolog to the penis. So it is right there. If you look at it, it has exactly the same structures as a male penis. So here you have the little hood or the prepuce. Okay, that's the same as the foreskin in the male. And if you remove all that tissue, you can see it looks exactly the same. You have glands, you actually have the corpus cavernosa, you're just missing the urethra, the sponginosum, because that's down here, okay? Okay. Okay, the mammary glands, okay? The breasts are modified sweat glands, okay? And milk production starts at or after childbirth. So now pregnancy, okay, that events leading to fertilization. Okay, so sperm meets egg. What has to happen is not single sperm meets egg, it about 10,000 sperm meets egg. Okay, what one single sperm can't fertilize an egg. Okay, that's why one of the male issue is low sperm count. Right, if you have a low sperm count, then you don't have enough sperm to get to the egg to do its job. Okay. Okay. So the picture. Okay. The sperm do not work individually. They work together because they have to puncture through these two layers that we talked about, the zona pellucida and the corona radiata. So here you can see the sperm getting in. Okay. They kind of wiggle their way through, and they have enzymes at the very tip that allows them to dissolve away the zona pellucida. Okay. Now, it is important they help each other through, but only one sperm can get in actually into the egg. You can't have multiple sperm get into the egg. That would screw up the genetics. So what happens as soon as one sperm enters is something called a cortical reaction. Okay? So one sperm enters, it sets off these little balls here. It sets off these little balls all around the egg, and basically they literally swell and they pop off the rest of the sperm. Okay, and that is called the fast lock to polyspermy. Okay, here the actual act of fertilization really isn't even the sperm hitting the egg. It is the two nucleuses, the sperm nucleus and the egg nucleus fusing. Okay. Okay. So I don't know if you guys remember, probably not, but I told you the mitochondrial DNA only comes from the mother. Okay, and the reason the mitochondrial DNA only comes from the mother is because here only the head of the sperm really gets into the cell. The rest of it stays on the outside. So here you can see, like, the only thing that matters is the nucleus fusing. Okay. All right. Um, we'll cover what the blastocyst is in chapter 3 when we go back. The blastocyst begins implantation. This occurs about 6 days after conception. Okay, the blastocyst is going to be a ball. That ball will implant into the endometrium here. Okay. Okay. The little ball will start invading, okay, into the functionalis and eventually get into the blood supply here, and it starts feeding off the blood supply here. Okay, so it takes 6 days after conception. So for 6 days, the embryo is not really feeding on anything. Okay, so that's why the egg has to be so big. It needs the nutrients to keep it sustained for a while. Okay, before implantation, it'll start to grow before implantation. Okay, so the egg has to be really huge and actually, get develop even before implantation, and you can take advantage of the maternal blood supply and maternal energy levels. Okay, so here you can see the blastocyst. Okay, going in. Okay, and it is hijacking the maternal blood supply here. Okay, it's growing these things called chorionic villi now. Okay, and then okay, so here you can see the beginning of a placenta here. Okay, with the chorionic villi, with the maternal blood supply that is sucking the maternal, like it's exchanging nutrients from the maternal blood supply. Okay. And here you can see a fully formed placenta. Okay. Okay, so there you go. This is 4.5-week embryo. So you can see this is a really cool picture actually. So you can see there's a yolk sac, but this yolk sac is actually pretty useless. It's actually in the blood supply here, or nutrient supply here, not the yolk. Here you can also see that there's a little tail and stuff like that. So, all right, the placenta is the only organ where there's embryonic and maternal tissues that contribute to the placenta. Okay, so here you can see these little things here are called the chorionic villi. They extract nutrients from the maternal blood supply here. The maternal blood supply just leaks into these little pools, and then the chorionic villi is able to extract nutrients from that into the fetal bloodstream. And these two do not actually mix. Okay. All right. So exchanges across the chorionic villi between the maternal and fetal blood. Okay. Okay. Oh, there you go. That's the picture I was looking for. The maternal blood leaks into these cavities here, and then the fetal chorionic villi actually sample the blood. Okay, extract nutrients from the blood. That's why you can cut out one of these and actually look at the fetal tissue, because this is from the fetus. Okay, that's why you do chorionic villi sampling. Okay. All right. Childbirth occurs 266 days after fertilization. Okay, technically they consider pregnancy to be 280 days. So there's 14 days missing here. The 14 days are actually from the day of your last ovulation. There's 14 days before fertilization. So those 14 days, it's technically part of your pregnancy, even though you haven't had sex yet, which is one of the weirder things that we've come up with to account for how to calculate pregnancy, because it's hard to figure out the day in which you had sex to fertilize the embryo, and sometimes it takes a day to like fertilize. So they count it from the day of your last period, first day of your last period. Okay. All right. The stages of labor. Okay. So the first stage is the longest. Okay. This is the dilation stage. The whole purpose of the dilation stage is to get the baby's head into the right position. Okay. And you'll notice the baby's head has to rotate as it comes through. Okay. And then expulsion is when the baby's head comes out. And then after that, the last stage is the placental stage. You have to shed the placenta after you give birth. If you don't, that placenta is a foreign organ inside the female, and it has no purpose, and it's full of blood and stuff, so it will rot, right? So you have to shove that out about half an hour after the birth. There's a final placenta that comes out. Okay, so the placenta detaches and comes out. Okay, I will skip the testicular cancer, the prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, blah blah. So cervical cancer. Okay, it's usually caused by HPV. Okay, so I mean now we actually know that we have a vaccine for it, and if you're sexually active, I highly suggest you take it. Males and females, since males, while the chance of getting cancer is lower, is not non-existent, and two, you can give it to the female. So if you have a vaccine, the breast cancer, okay, is the second most common cancer death in women, second to lung cancer. Okay, there are genes that are associated with breast cancer, so make sure if you have a family history of breast cancer, you should check out for those genes. Okay, they're called BRCA1 and BRCA2. Okay. Puberty is a period of life between ages 10 and 15. In females, it starts earlier. In males, it starts a little later. The events of puberty occur in the same sequence in all individuals. The age at which puberty occurs varies widely. It actually depends a lot on nutrient levels in the body. Okay, back 300-400 years ago, it was not uncommon for females to hit 15, 16 before they hit puberty, because they just didn't have enough nutrition. Okay, those those days, the vast majority of people were on the verges of starvation all the time. So, especially protein starvation. Now, given the nutrient levels and everything and how we understand everything, it is not unusual for girls to hit puberty 10, 11, 12. Okay. So males occur about a little bit later. So age 13. And here, I'm sure you guys all know this already. Okay. Okay. There you go. You can read all that. Menopause. Okay. The actual female reproductive peak is actually late 20s. So like if you want to, have a child, that is the best, easiest time for a female to get pregnant. Okay. Around the age of 35, the rate of follicular degeneration increases, and then you hit ovulation. You hit menopause. Okay. Menopause, ovulation, and menstruation cease at around 46 to 54. The ovaries stop secreting estrogen. The reproductive organs and breast begin to atrophy. Okay. The reason for this is actually pretty complicated, but basically, at this age, you're more reproductive if you take care of your grandchildren than if you have more children. Therefore, the female reproductive system shuts down, and there's no more pregnancy. Okay, pregnancy is a risky thing for human females before medical practice. Okay, 1 out of 8 females died during childbirth. Okay. All right. So that ends this chapter. There's only one more chapter left, and that's not even a full chapter. Right. So we're going to skim over the important parts of chapter 3.